Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Victorian team at the Institute of Architects, I'd like to offer you all a warm welcome to today's Lean-In session, where we will be looking at Infrastructure Victoria's latest research report, Our Home Choices, How More Housing Options Can Be Better Use of Victoria's Existing Infrastructure. My name is Liz Siosio, and I'm a Senior Associate here at Architectus in Melbourne, and it's an honour to be your host and moderator for today's Lean-In session. We're joining from across the country today. We acknowledge with deep respect the traditional owners of this land. We acknowledge that it is a privilege to stand on country and walk in footsteps of those before us, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Today's Lean-In session will be recorded, so if you miss anything today or have to leave early, we'll be publishing this recording on the Institute's YouTube channel in the next couple of days, and you should get a link sent to you through some upcoming email correspondence. This Lean-In session enables you to ask questions of our panelists, so if you have any or any comments, please use our Q&A box down below to add yours in, and I'll go through these with the panelists later on in the session. Today's session features two panelists, Chief Executive Officer Jonathan Spear. He has led Infrastructure Victoria's work on Victoria's 30-year infrastructure strategy, research program and provision of independent advice to the Victorian Government. He's joined by Dr. Kath Phelan, who is currently Principal Planner at Infrastructure Victoria, where she focuses on improving the integration of land use and infrastructure. Jonathan and Kath, welcome to our Lean-In session. It's great to have you with us.
Thanks very much, Liz. Pleasure to be here, and thanks to the Institute for the opportunity to speak with you about this. Great. Well, thank you so much. We are indeed here to hear about our home choices, work that Infrastructure Victoria has done. For those of you who aren't familiar with Infrastructure Victoria, we are the independent infrastructure advisor to the state government and state parliament. And I'll explain in a minute why an independent infrastructure advisor is talking about things like planning policy and design quality. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting. We're on the Wurundjeri people's lands here in Melbourne, and I'd like to pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. Can I just check with Liz and Kath to make sure the slides are moving and so forth? Yeah, great. I want to make sure everyone can see them. Excellent. All right. So today I'll give you a sense of why we did this research, the approach that we took to doing it, and then Kath and I will discuss our research findings and policy options with you, and really looking forward to Q&A with you. All of the reports, both the main report on our home choices that I'll talk about, but also all the supporting technical reports from Infrastructure Victoria and consultants who work with us, are all available to you on Infrastructure Victoria's website if you'd like to dig in and learn more. So why did we look at our home choices? So the amount and the type of where homes are located makes a really big difference to the infrastructure that we need in Victoria. And I think the same goes for other cities around Australia and around the world. And we've done previous work that showed that it costs up to 4 times more to deliver the infrastructure that a new home needs in a greenfield area of Melbourne as compared to incremental delivery of infrastructure in established areas as new homes are developed in those established areas. So that's one of the things that's at stake here in terms of the cost of infrastructure and the use of the infrastructure we already have. The other thing that's at stake is that Plan Melbourne, the state's strategic planning policy, has an aspiration for 70% of new homes to be delivered in established areas. But that's not the result that we've been collectively achieving. And in fact, in recent years, the share of new homes built in established suburbs has been declining to a bit under 50%. And that has real consequences. It has consequences for where people live, the journeys that they need to take, the proximity they have to services and jobs and opportunities. And so What we wanted to better understand is, well, why are we getting that result currently? Why are people choosing, in the most part, to live in the greenfield suburbs at the edges of Melbourne and some of our regional cities like Geelong and Ballarat, and deeply understand what's driving those housing choices, and also look at whether there is an opportunity to change those choices. And we took this research approach very much with an open mind as to what we might find. And you'll see that some of what we found is quite intuitive, but also some of it was a bit surprising. So I'll take you through it. Firstly, it's probably worth outlining the research approach that we took. So we looked at, well, what is all the existing literature and studies that are already done on people's housing for preferences and choices. Very importantly, we actually talked to a whole bunch of focus groups that we pulled together, largely of people who live in greenfield suburbs, but some that don't, to understand why do people choose where they go in a qualitative way. But then we backed that up with the biggest quantitative study that's ever been done in Australia on this subject. So we surveyed over 6,000 people in Geelong, Melbourne and Ballarat who were quite representative of the populations of those areas, to better understand their housing choices, but also what was driving those choices and what would change if the conditions of their decision under which they were making decisions change. And we'll take you through some of that later on, because what that allowed us to do is quite sophisticated choice modelling. The other thing we did is we got together a very vast range of real estate data that our economists dived into to better understand availability and pricing of homes, and what that meant for affordability and choice. And we used all of this research to then come up with policy options that the Victorian government could utilise to drive better outcomes, to achieve greater housing choice for people and better use of the infrastructure we have and have planned in the pipeline. So where we start is the start of people's housing journey, if you like. That our focus groups that we talked to were very clear to us that when they start to look for a home, they have a notional ideal of a home, and it's not very surprising what that is. It tends to be a large detached home, 3 or 4 bedrooms, has secure parking. It's often located in an established suburb that's near family and friends. And then the trade-offs start to happen. And the trade-off that people have, which is often around price and affordability, is a trade-off between how much of those attributes of the home, the ideal home they want to retain, versus the location of the home. And what we find is that the majority of people, nearly 70% of the people we surveyed and did choice modelling with, will prioritise retaining as much of the attributes of the home as they can versus location. So we see a very strong preference towards retaining the size of the home, its detached nature and parking. And so that's perhaps not surprising, but it is one of the things that is driving more people to move to greenfield areas as they pursue the achievement of that ideal notional home. And so when we talk to the focus group members, we get a really sort of rich sense of that. There's a few quotes you can see here. And if you're interested in this, the full report is available and you can sort of dig into the depth of what people told us. But people are making very rational choices. And this is something I think worth emphasising, because sometimes there is a sense that if only people knew what was good for them, then they wouldn't go and live in these greenfield areas. Well, actually, our research, both the quantitative and the quality research, shows that people are making very clear, deliberate choices about the way they want to live and the trade-offs that they're making on location, particularly between location and sense of the home. And we get people drawing that out quite plainly in the discussions, both people who moved to the greenfield areas because that was really clear about what they wanted, a living space, and they're willing to trade off distance, but also some people who were very clear that they wanted to live in an inner suburb, that they didn't want to commute, and that they were willing to trade off the size of the home and in exchange for better location. The other thing that comes through very clearly from our research when we looked at the prices that people are paying and the data on real estate is that middle suburbs of Melbourne and regional cities like Geelong and Ballarat are locked out for middle income earners. And so what we did is we looked at, for people who are a moderate income earner, between around $90,000 and $130,000 a year of household income, it's really only on the edges of our cities that they're able to purchase a home that is coming close to their notional ideal of a home, of that freestanding home. And as you get closer in, and you can see this on the map here that we're showing now, and there's much more a variety of those maps in our reports if you want to dig into this. What you see is the blue and the green is people are able to afford houses or townhouses around 3 bedrooms, and as that gets into the grey, there's really nothing affordable to a moderate income owner. And so that's the other thing that is driving people to the fringes of our cities, and it really tells us that we've got a challenge in unlocking housing choice, especially for moderate income earners, where price and supply of those homes is really very limited. And we'll come back to some of the supply issues later on. The other thing that's driving price is the proximity of infrastructure to people's homes. So we see that there is a very clear connection and a correlation between housing prices in inner and middle areas of our cities and the availability of infrastructure like trains, secondary schools, tram stops, and so forth. And as we go out to the edges of our cities, then there's a less of a contribution of the proximity of infrastructure to the price. And so you can see that on these maps that show both houses and townhouses. And so the more red there is on these maps, the more the proximity to infrastructure is correlated to the price of the home. And on the edges of our cities where there does tend to be less of that infrastructure, that's making the homes more affordable. But of course, at the cost of less infrastructure provision. The other thing that we then looked at when we did the survey of 6,000 people and choice modelling with them about what they were sensitive to and what would change their choices is that people are very price sensitive. People are particularly sensitive to changes in the prices of homes in growth areas, and if those prices actually or are perceived to increase, that will tend to drive more people to change their choice and live in established areas of Melbourne or our regional cities as well. And importantly, around 1 in 5 households told us that they would be happy and prefer, in fact, to trade their house and land size to live in an established suburb in a medium density, good quality design home for a similar price to what they would pay in the greenfields. And when you go to regional cities, we get an even stronger result. So in Ballarat, 1 in 4 households would be preferring to trade a greenfields home for one established Ballarat, and in Geelong it's 1 in 3 households which would rather. So that gives us a sense of the level of opportunity there is to provide greater choice to people. 1 in 5 in Melbourne, down to 1 in 3 households in Geelong. It also, of course, is a warning to us that not everybody wants to live in established suburbs, and that we need to continue to deliver, good quality design and the planning of those suburbs, the delivery of the infrastructure, and of course the quality of the homes as well, that this audience is so passionate about. And this gives you a bit of an example here that when you change when you drop prices of townhouses and apartments in established areas and increase 10% the price of homes in growth areas, we do see quite a significant geographical shift from the edges of our cities to the more established areas of our cities where people are telling us they would rather live. And what we see is that households are certainly willing to consider higher density of homes where they can get those for a similar price, for the right price. They are absolutely willing to shift from their initial choice of a detached home to substitute for, in particular, townhouses and low-rise apartments in established areas of our cities. And an important finding of this is that there's not a strong number of people who would shift from a home in a greenfield areas to a high-rise small apartment. So high-rise 1 and 2 bedroom apartments, which we have plenty of in Melbourne, aren't really the solution that this group of people who would otherwise move to greenfield areas want. They were really interested in being able to substitute for often 3 bedroom or so townhouses or low-rise, medium-density apartments in established areas of Melbourne or our regional cities. So when you step back from that research, what is it telling us? It's telling us that people really highly value the size and the features of their homes, such as the number of bedrooms, and that's really, really strong. That it's also telling us that home buyers will choose a townhouse or a large low-rise apartment instead of a freestanding home in the greenfield areas, but they're not really interested in small high-rise units. That's not to say that future population growth in Melbourne can't be accommodated in part by those small high-rise apartments. We're going to have about 1 million more people come to Melbourne every decade for the next 3 decades. But when we're looking at greenfield housing choice, the people who are currently choosing to be there and where would they move, it's not the high-rise, smaller apartments they are after. Price is definitely having a big influence on people's decisions, and people would certainly, move from greenfield to established areas if there was a greater affordability of equivalent product at equivalent price. A couple of other things that came out from our discussions with the focus groups is perceptions about quality of homes. A perception that detached homes are built to better quality than apartments and townhouses, and also the suitability of apartments to raise families in was something that was raised as well. And we'll come back to some of that when Kath talks later on. And so many households will still choose to live in greenfield areas, as I said earlier. So we've got to be able to do 2 things at once. We've got to be able to both continue to improve and deliver high quality greenfield suburbs, but we can turn down the dial on that. We can turn off the heat. That is where a lot of that growth is being accepted at the moment, but we're struggling to deliver the infrastructure that those growing communities need, and we can actually unlock the choice that people tell us that they want to live in some established areas in that medium density housing product that we're not really delivering much of at the moment, certainly not at an affordable price. So what is to be done? This is where we looked at what are the policies that are available to Victorian government that might be able to unlock those choices and make better use of the infrastructure that we have in established areas. And our research showed us that there's really 3 main areas. So firstly, there's some funny things going on with the way people are incentivized through prices and grants that are driving people to move to greenfield areas more than they would otherwise if those weren't in play. And I'll take you through that shortly. Then there's the challenge of actually building and delivering more homes in established suburbs, particularly ones that are well located near good existing transport infrastructure. And then there's the challenge of increasing the diversity of homes in established areas so that they are suitable for often families to make a choice instead of greenfield areas to live in established areas. Just a quick side note, I guess, about what we didn't look at in this research. So our policy work that we've done and presented to government is not focused on renters. That's because most of the people who are moving to the greenfield areas are moving there to buy, and that was the focus of our work. But of course, renters, rental affordability, the quality of rental homes is something that we care deeply about, and have made actually recommendations to government in the 30-year infrastructure strategy that we table in Parliament. Similarly, the focus of this work wasn't on social housing. We've had lots to say about social housing and the need for continued investment in that, and it's good to see that that's started, and we're going to need to continue that drive for additional social housing investment. That wasn't the focus of this work, again, because that's not where the majority of the demand is for the greenfield areas. And we haven't looked at all of Victoria. We're aware, of course, that there's challenges, especially in some of our smaller regional towns, in terms of delivering housing, often for the workforce that they need. We've really been focusing this work again on Geelong, Melbourne, and Ballarat, where we've got greenfield growth and a possibility, as we've seen from the research, to rebalance and unlock some choice there. So on price disincentives to buying in established suburbs, there's a few things going on here, and you might have seen some reporting of some of this in the media actually in the last few weeks. Firstly, there's the infrastructure contribution schemes, which are levied on developers and passed through, of course, to purchasers, and they relate to both local and state government infrastructure. And what our research and the research of many others who've looked at this and done reviews and finds, and when we talk to lots of stakeholders, no one's really very happy with the current state of the infrastructure contribution regimes. They tend to be quite slow and cumbersome in terms of the way in which they operate. They don't actually raise a lot of money, and that money often isn't spent in a timely way to actually benefit the communities in those areas. And there's a whole lot of exceptions as to where they do and don't apply across the state. So to us, that's clearly one of the opportunities that government has to simplify infrastructure contribution schemes, to make sure they apply more broadly, and in particular to be able to raise some contribution both in established and greenfield areas where we've got growing populations that need to be accommodated with their infrastructure that they need. Now, that's important for price because, of course, it needs to reflect the prices and the relative prices between established and greenfield areas, and do that in a way that's fair and delivers the infrastructure that growing communities need. The other things that are distorting people's choices, one is stamp duty. So it's not uncommon to hear economists say the stamp duty is an inefficient tax and that doesn't help with productivity. What our research shows is that in addition to all of those reasons why stamp duty is challenging, that it actually constrains people's housing choices in a couple of ways. Firstly, where people don't like to pay stamp duty more than once. And so they tend to buy a larger home earlier in their life course than they need to avoid paying it again. And that tends to be homes, those larger homes that are affordable early in life tend to be in greenfield areas. So that drives people to buy in greenfield areas, amongst all sorts of other factors. The other issue is the stamp duty concessions really apply up to properties worth around $750,000, and they are often the ones that are available in the greenfield areas. So we've called for a review of stamp duty, particularly the concessions, because of the way that tends to distort people's choices and makes greenfield areas more attractive compared to established areas. The other issue is subsidies like the first homeowner grant. That has similar qualification requirements in that it's only available for homes valued up to around $750,000. And it's only available for newly built homes. So, of course, that only really applies for greenfield areas. The problem is that there's quite a lot of research that shows that the first homeowner grant does not actually make homes cheaper for purchasers, because the cost is passed through by developers to purchasers. And this collectively is costing us between 150 and around $250 million a year as taxpayers. So we've got a first homeowner grant that our focus groups tell us is absolutely making them buy homes sooner in greenfield areas, but is not improving affordability and is costing the taxpayer on average about $150 million a year. So we don't think that's a very effective policy or use of taxpayers' money. What we've suggested is removal of the first homeowners grant and replacement by the Victorian government with a much greater use of shared equity schemes, which can be applied not just in greenfield areas, but to support first home buyers across the state and across all sorts of different housing products. And there's the existing Victorian Home Buyers Fund, which can be scaled up to allow that to happen. And we think that's a more effective and less distortionary way of supporting first home buyers compared to the first home buyer grant. So with that, I'd now like to take the opportunity to hand over to my colleague, Kath, who's going to talk through some of the other policy options that we've developed. Thanks, Kath.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. So we've got a few policy options here for the Victorian government to consider that particularly talk about how to get more homes in the established parts of our urban areas close to transport and services. So very consistent with what we always talk about at Infrastructure Victoria, which is the better use of our existing infrastructure. So the first one here talks about local housing targets. We really think there's value in the government thinking about setting up targets for new homes in each local government area, particularly within Melbourne, at least to begin. But we think that work should actually be done in collaboration with local government, that it's not just something that the Victorian government should determine on their own. We think that close working relationship is really, really important. And also we think that there is a place for incentives to get local governments actually to try and meet those targets too. And it's really learning from some of the experience up in New South Wales. If the government takes on doing targets, they really need to keep track of what's going on. Actually measuring that progress towards actually meeting the targets is really important, and to then publicly report on that as well. And because we're particularly interested in making sure that there really are these substitutes for greenfield homes, that there should be some reporting on the dwelling type as well and its characteristics, given that we've heard that these are really, really important to people. The second one talk in this group looks at urban renewal precincts. These are really important places within our existing urban areas, and especially in Melbourne. And we've talked quite a bit about precincts in our 30-year strategy, and we want to reiterate it again here. That precincts are important places to actually get some more housing supply in our established areas, but we're also very aware that they won't be able to do everything by any means, or even the SRL precincts will not be sufficient to actually meet the sort of projected kind of dwelling growth that we're likely to have in Melbourne. But nonetheless, these precincts are really, really important, and we think the Victorian government needs to actually go through a process of prioritising which ones are sort of important and developing some criteria around that for actually that prioritisation framework. We then think after some really good, robust strategic planning that closely engages communities, that in return, some planning approvals could actually be streamlined in those areas. Precincts also would be a good place to actually test out some of the target idea and actually the government could set some targets for each precinct, looking at the number, the type and the size of new homes. We also think that there's a real role here, potentially for an organisation like Development Victoria, to build some demonstration projects in precincts to really show the market that you can actually build projects that include 3-bedroom dwellings as well. And then the third option here is really starting to look at that low-rise apartment built form and where they can go. So looking at the residential growth zone. And Jonathan, if I could get you to go to the next slide, that would be great. So as we have heard, Jonathan's described, most of the households who would consider moving into established Melbourne have a much stronger preference for low-rise apartments than high-rise apartments. But at the moment, the low-rise apartments actually make up a very small proportion of new homes in Melbourne's established suburbs. But these areas are those that actually have really good access to public transport and, of course, better access to other forms of infrastructure and services. A lot of the homes in these areas, that they are aging and quite, will require upgrading so that they're up to date with contemporary energy efficiency and sustainability standards. But what we see is that development's often restricted by the sort of limited, the limits that are within the existing zones and how they're actually distributed that really constrain opportunities for density. Now, local governments assess low-rise apartments, so those are with 4 or fewer stories, using res code, which does look about how those buildings operate in the context of surrounding neighbourhoods, which often really are pretty low density, particularly when you compare it to other cities around the world. These assessments typically do focus on neighbourhood character and community concerns, but of course that can lead to a lot of uncertainty and a lot of development delays. Now, Res Code has now incorporated some of the better apartment design standards, which is great to see, but we think a bit more could be done because at the moment they're really looking at sort of general development quality and sort of internal layouts. But we think there's some work that could potentially be done there about really thinking about this particular building type in relationship to neighbourhood character. So more specifically, what we're suggesting the Victorian Government could do is actually include some specific objectives and residential development standards for this particular type of building and include them in the Victoria planning provisions. We think those existing res code guidance could actually be better customised, so to really talk to things like site layout, building massing and amenity impacts, particularly focusing on these 3- and 4-storey buildings. We also think there's a real argument to be made that standards can actually help local governments in their process of actually reviewing applications for these types of buildings. Standards also can help give clarity and also point developers sort of in the right direction as well around design, and you also potentially increase the likelihood of actually getting approvals for these buildings. Now, we also suspect there might be a bit of an opportunity here as well for using more modular construction techniques for this building type, which can also improve affordability of these homes. But you've also got to have places to be able to build them. So we've suggested that the residential growth zone is a good zone to actually expand in our established suburbs to allow more of these types of buildings, and particularly to focus in areas that have good public transport and services. Again, Victorian Government should develop some criteria to identify places that would be more appropriate to expand this zone. So you could use things like access to public transport as one of your criteria there. We also think the Victorian Government should work very closely with local government to make any of these kind of zoning changes. And in fact, provide some funding to local governments to actually go back and review their residential zones and schedules, and at the same time have a think about what kind of infrastructure upgrades might be necessary to really provide good support for that residential growth zone. There's also, I think, probably for this one, quite a lot that we could potentially learn from the Future Homes project as that sort of gets going, particularly in pilot areas. But we just point out that program is actually really designed for the general residential zone and not residential growth zone, and only goes up to 3 stories. But we've identified really that there's a bit of a gap around that 4th story. Jonathan, we could go to the next one, thanks. So this next group of policy options for the Victorian Government really talk about diversity and choice of homes. So to make sure that we're giving people options in these established areas as an alternative to living in the growth areas. Now, the first one talks very much to the sort of the most immediate substitute, which is around dual occupancy in townhouses. And I'll go into a bit of detail about that one next, but I'll just run you through these 3. The second one talks about car parking, and that really we need to rethink about what kind of requirements we have around car parking when we're thinking about making homes more affordable. And then the third one talks about child-friendly design in new apartments. I'll just quickly touch on this one here. We think it's probably timely to, again, think for the Victorian Government to think about updating the better apartment design standards to really talk about apartments that are suitable for families with children, for households with children. That we need, a third of growth area households with children have said that they would live in apartments if they were less expensive, but they need to have 3 bedrooms at least. Now, the changes to BADs could look at things like making apartments more accessible, more versatile, and actually also safer for children. And there's lots of really great suggestions in the parliamentary inquiry into apartment design standards that we wholeheartedly endorse. We also think there's a role here, again, for design review panels, which we've talked about previously in our 30-year strategy. And once again, also, government come in and do some demonstration projects to show the market that this really is possible. But let's go back to the dual occupancy and townhouse code. And so this option for government, it talks about trying to actually set up an optional code that would, if you choose to use the code, then you can actually get faster through a faster permitting process. But we also think it's really important that more generally that there needs to be better visual guidance for well-designed dual occupancies and townhouses. So as I said, townhouses can potentially be that more immediate substitute for households currently choosing to live out in the growth areas. But there are definitely concerns, people have concerns about the quality of our existing the new townhouses that are on the market at the moment, particularly around noise, privacy, security, and just the sheer amount of space in the dwellings. Now, there are definitely examples of good design, but Res Code itself doesn't always produce the high quality townhouses at an affordable price. So we've identified some shortcomings, which I'm sure this audience is more than familiar with, around solar orientation, private open space, and environmental performance. At the same time, we also see from a sort of planning process perspective that you are getting delays and uncertainty in approvals, and those do add to development costs, which of course are ultimately passed on to consumers. Now, we did a really interesting piece of work called Density Done Well to support our infrastructure strategy, and we found that communities indeed are willing to support high density, but what they really identify as the most important thing is quality urban design, so that getting buildings that integrate well into their local neighbourhoods. So with this policy option, we think the Victorian government can actually encourage this well-designed, smaller scale development by having this a voluntary code for these areas, say particularly around close to public transport. It could apply first to dual occupancy and then potentially expand to townhouses. So sort of you do a phased introduction. And the code could then incentivise compliant proposals to have a quicker assessment process. So that then gives developers faster approvals and a bit more certainty around the process. And we also think the code can actually incentivise better design as well. The code itself would need to really better account for neighbourhood character, amenity and infrastructure. So for example, by minimising overshadowing and mitigating urban heat. Now, of course, site-specific heritage, environment and landscape controls, of course, remain very, very important. And we think that actually those should continue to trigger just your regular planning permit process. Now, we think, again, we're big on collaboration in Infrastructure Victoria. We suggest that the Victorian government should actually work very closely with local government and developers, and naturally with architects, to actually create this code, because we believe that's a great way to build support for the approach as well. We've already got Western local governments who've been actually developing these kind of guidelines, so in Darebin, Glen Eira, Knox and Marybeck. And of course, again, Future Homes may well offer some useful insights. And we do think there also is a role to be played for visual guidance, particularly for projects that aren't going to choose to use the code. That there's much more clarity around design, sustainability and accessibility outcomes that could sit in this visual guidance, and really talk to environmentally sustainable design and universal access. Now, we also think that Res Code could do with a bit of visual guidance as well, just to give some clear information about desired outcomes for projects that don't take up the code. Jonathan, let's talk car parking. So this particular option for the Victorian government really talks about re-looking at those minimum parking requirements that we have at the moment, and that really the government could consider reducing or removing the current requirements if proposed projects are close to good public transport. We think that home buyers actually should be allowed to choose how much on-site parking they want to pay for above some minimum requirements. So at the moment, as I'm sure you're all very familiar with in Victoria, we have requirements for 1 and 2 bedroom homes have 1 space on site for each home and 2 spaces for homes for 3 bedrooms or more. Now, if you want to actually have put up a proposal that has less than that car parking, then you actually have to go through a permit process as well. And so we see this as actually imposing a regulatory burden on new homes, which are proposing to actually have less car parking. And in fact, it ends up forcing homeowners to pay for car parking that they might not want. And also it can discourage developers from building larger homes because they're having to allocate space to car parking that they could otherwise allocate to the actual dwelling size. Now, the whole theory around car parking requirements is, of course, it's to reduce the demand for on-street car parking. That's sort of the theoretical assumption there. But actually, by having on-site requirements, you're actually reducing the cost of actually driving on local streets, because by requiring car parking on-site, you're reducing the overall cost of car ownership. And then more cars on local streets leads to congestion. So, the last thing you really necessarily want to do in these established areas where you've got good public transport is actually reducing those perceived costs of driving. Now, of course, providing car parking really does affect developers, development feasibility. And this table here on the slide is from a really interesting research project from Nigel Bertram and Leanne Core at the University of Melbourne, looking at townhouses in Footscray and the impact of car parking on the number and cost of 3-bedroom units that a developer could build. And of course, we're really interested in those 3 bedrooms because we think that is your substitute for the growth areas. So by reducing at-grade or above-ground car spaces from 2 to 1 per dwelling, actually allowed the project to build an extra home while also decreasing the sale price for each unit. Now, when you actually get rid of when you reduce the underground car parking from 2 to 1 space per dwelling, you could actually double the number of dwellings in this particular project and see the sale price again fall per unit. So reducing these minimums is likely to benefit households who might choose less car parking if they had the option, where at the moment they really just don't have that choice. And of course, we know from census data that people living in apartments close to public transport actually have lower car ownership rates. And actually the quality and frequency of public transport also influences car ownership. Of course, existing residents often worry that there's going to be this spillover of new people moving into an area that don't have car parking associated with their new dwelling. They're all going to end up parking on the street. But actually, there's evidence that shows that most on-street car parking is actually used by residents of detached housing. So most of the people who park on street already actually have sufficient off-street parking. And people who live in apartments use comparatively less on-street car parking. And of course, in most places are not eligible for on-street parking permits. So we've suggested that the Victorian government could reduce or even remove some of these minimum requirements. Another option is to consider requiring providing dedicated publicly accessible car sharing spaces. Another idea would be to actually unbundle parking so that actually developers could sell car parking spaces separately to the actual dwelling itself. And of course, really important that the Victorian government could actually really support local governments to manage their on-street car parking as well, particularly in areas where it's currently congested. Talk to local government. They're the ones who really know what's going on with their car parking in their local streets, and they could probably do with some funding or giving them some help with some technical expertise around this. Now, of course, developers can continue to provide more than the minimum requirements, or homeowners could choose to pay for more if they actually need it. So again, it's about giving more choice to people and also reducing those costs, allowing more lower priced homes to be built in established suburbs. Jonathan, I'll hand over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Kath. Great to dive into some of the detail of those. And I'm sure, as the audience can tell, there's really important opportunities for architects to support and implement this range of reforms, but particularly those ones that Kath's just been through. There's the real opportunity to bring those particular skills that the architecture profession and the Institute can bring in implementing changes like this and actually delivering better design, which, you know, the community tell us that they want. It's a key part of what they want to live in and what they want to see in the neighbourhoods that they live in now and the future. And we know that really good design quality is a core part of the acceptability of, you know, a greater number of people living in established areas of our cities. So where to from here? So what we have done is we have given government a suggested timeline around implementation of these options, and we've suggested that things like reforming of infrastructure contributions, removing some of those subsidies like the first home buyer grant, and setting targets for exactly where good places are for increased housing development in established areas. Those are things that really should be begun now. Then there's a range of statutory and planning reforms that will need to happen through legislative change. Things like the prioritisation and streamlining of approvals in both urban renewal precincts, but also the dual occupancy and townhouse code that Kath talked through, and the ability to have better standards for low-rise apartments and expand the residential growth zone, and some of the changes to parking requirements that Kath was just talking about. Those are things that can happen within the next few years. We think that there's some urgency to doing that because we know that unlocks real opportunity and the delivery of greater housing choice. Things like stamp duty reform and changes to the way in which first home buyers are supported might take a little bit longer. Stamp duty reform in particular is something that's likely to need to be sequenced over quite a number of years to manage the fiscal impact that has on the state government budget. And we don't think that we're going to click our fingers and have all apartments turn into, you know, child-friendly playhouses tomorrow, but starting to give greater guidance on that, as Kath was describing earlier, is something that can certainly roll through in the medium term. So thank you very much for being interested in this subject and really looking forward with Liz to hearing some of the questions that you've got. As I said earlier, that we think that there's a really big opportunity for the Institute and the profession to support these policy changes as they make their way through government consideration. We've been really heartened by the really positive feedback that we've had from a range of property sector stakeholders, including the Institute, but also, you know, I think places like Property Council and the Master Builders and the HIA and the UDIA. So there's clearly a consensus across the industry that specialises in the built form and in planning and design, that change is needed, and that these are the sorts of changes that are needed. And then there's a really big opportunity for you to bring your skills to bear in implementing them once those changes go through. It's an important time at the moment. The government's indicated that it's going to release a housing statement later this year, and the government's indicated that there is an update to Plan Melbourne coming as well. So now is the time to be getting behind reforms like this that can really set us up for better cities, better housing choice, and of course, better design. So with that, Liz, I'm really looking forward to hearing what the questions are from the audience.
Thank you, Jonathan and Kath. It's just such interesting research. So appreciate the presentation this morning. Look, we've got a few questions here. So I'll start with one that caught my eye from Merrick. So thank you very much for this well overdue and rigorous research on housing choices. As it's been made clear, participants see dwelling size and perhaps the size of their garage, particularly around bedroom numbers. But, you know, what did you guys find through your research around impacts of larger living areas and communal areas in those decisions around medium and high density developments on their preferences? So did you see that coming through? Or was it very much about, I need 3 bedrooms, I've got a family, that kind of thing?
Yeah, great question. Look, Kathy, you'll probably want to add to this. I think we see that distinct choice, that distinct split around between size and location that comes through really strongly. Perhaps the other thing that came through in terms of sizes of homes, which might have been a legacy of the time when we did this research. So we talked to the participants around the middle of last year. The effect of COVID and spending more time and also starting to work from home was definitely in their minds. And so it wasn't the sole driver, but in some instances, it was one of the things that people expressed as a reason for being more comfortable with and wanting a slightly larger home, in particular a home that they could work in as well some of the week. So that came through. But Kath, what else would you like to add in terms of what we heard from the research on that?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think when it comes to the communal areas, particularly in apartment buildings that are being built at the moment, they are adding to the cost in those high density buildings. And though, it's seen as sort of a premium thing. And I think there was a very strong understanding certainly coming through in the focus groups of, well, I'm not interested in living in a building with a swimming pool. I would much rather have my house in the growth areas where I've got my own space, my own private garden, it's tiny, but that's fine. That suits me. I don't want to spend a lot of time gardening. So I think that goes to that, that the high rise with all its, fancy communal areas is not going to be that immediate substitute. But it's very clear from research, and this came through also into the inquiry into apartment design standards, that communal areas are so important for families, especially if they're living in those smaller places. They really do put a value on them, but they don't want to be in these sort of very fancy high-rise kind of buildings. So definitely, something that should be looked at in the next sort of next round of review of the better apartment design standards, definitely, and I think it's also there's this whole debate, of course, about how do you do your minimum space requirements? Should you actually go down to the detail of make sure a table of this particular size could fit into a room? I mean, this is where we've got to really trust architects to really understand how you design good dwellings, how spaces work together, rather than necessarily always resorting to those sort of minimum standards. I think let's not underestimate the experience that architects have in this particular space as well. So, yeah.
I might touch on one other thing, Liz. It just Kath mentioned the sort of premium nature of some apartments, and this is something that sort of came through both in the research and sort of discussions we've had since, which is we've, as an industry, in terms of delivering housing, we've got pretty good at delivering high-rise apartments, pretty good at delivering detached homes on the edges of our cities, and increasingly delivering quite premium medium density housing in established areas. But of course, that premium product is not really at a price point that's substitutable for moderate income or slightly higher households who are living in greenfield areas. So one of the big challenges that we've got is designing and delivering homes that are not super premium, but they are of good design quality, 3 or 4 bedroom townhouses or low-rise apartments that are meeting those needs, unlocking that choice that families want, but not necessarily the premium price point. And that's something that we probably need to learn to do and demonstrate that we can do.
Yeah, and I think when you think of the, of an affordability lens over projects, when you're looking at how much amenity you might provide on site, you're very much looking at what is around the site. And so I guess the theory is with the established areas is that hopefully the parks and the open space for play and the thing, that you don't need to keep duplicating everything to the same quantity on every project.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great question. Just to extend on that, there was a really specific question from one of your early slides around the infrastructure costs, looking at 2 to 4 times higher when you consider the greenfield sites. There was just a clarification on that around, did that include the dwelling construction as well, or was it really about the sort of bones of the structure of roads and services?
Yeah, great question. So no, it's not about the dwelling cost. What we looked at, and this is a few years ago, where we looked at cost of delivering the sort of, if you like, the trunk infrastructure that a new home needs. And it didn't include some of the really big chunky costs like extending railway lines and freeways and so forth. But in a greenfield area, yeah, Kath just posted up in the chat, but in a greenfield area, how much does it cost to incrementally deliver some of those utilities and services that the new home needs compared to established areas?
Yeah, like I always sort of think when I am sort of driving through the outskirts of Victoria, just when you start to see that the roads are there, you're imagining that the houses are going to come next, and you just wonder, when are the schools and the housing centres? Just to expand on that, I'm really interested, is there a normal pattern to that? Which maybe is some of the issues around that amenity conversation when we look at that. Because you think about medical centre, schools, the libraries, the community centre kind of thing, that really means that people, have move into a sense of well-being around community.
Yeah, so there is a pattern to it. We don't always do it perfectly. It's something that Victorian Planning Authority and Victorian Government have got increasingly good at, is predicting things like schools and when and where schools are going to be needed in growing areas. And that's some of the precinct planning work that's done. And so we've definitely improved on that over the year. That's to our collective credit. You actually mentioned it was some of the more community-focused facilities, though, are not always delivered as consistently as we would like. And the two I'd call out is aquatic centres and libraries. We've done specific research on that and made recommendations actually in our 30-year infrastructure strategy, because what we found was that the growth areas of Melbourne, particularly the north and west, where you have
I think Jonathan's just dropped out momentarily. I can continue a little bit with this. So we went through an exercise of just looking at aquatic centres and libraries to look at how they're provided across our growth areas versus established areas, and definitely found that the provision was much less in those growth areas. And so it was a really good spatial mapping exercise. And the reason why we looked at those two is because the Victorian Government is actually involved in actually providing some funding for both of those forms of community infrastructure.
Great, thank you. Thanks for stepping in, Kath, on that one. Hope you're back with us, Jonathan. Look, I'll run through these because I'm mindful of time, and there's some great other questions, so they'll dart around a little bit, but I'll try and group them into a theme. So one here, I live and practice in New South Wales. Why are we so slow at implementing medium density residential zones in order to utilise this existing infrastructure and provide better quality homes? And just to add to that, my also question is around, have we done the assessment about the actual upgrade requirements to existing infrastructure, such as stormwater, sewage drainage, lighting, streets, those kind of things, if we start to implement more density in those areas?
Yeah, it's a good question, Liz. It's something that actually we're in the process of doing research on at the moment. So stay tuned because at Infrastructure Victoria, we've been doing more detailed research on different levels of density and population distribution across the states and across Victoria, and be happy to come back and have a chat with you about that before the end of the year when we're going to be releasing that work.
It's great to hear. Another question here, have you looked at measures that government might take to allow for site amalgamations to allow more flexibility in the site layout? And I guess that another thing to add to that in my head is just, as you talk about a code or a sort of visual guide of how to get great design outcomes. And I liked it, Kath, that you did acknowledge that architects do know a thing or two about quality outcomes, and that standards are there for those that really aren't quite sure where to start. But yeah, just really keen to understand if there's some of those sort of lateral thinking ideas, because very much when we look at maybe areas where density is achieved, but is the quality good, is where the scale of housing is still the same and the minimum setbacks and overlooking is being utilised. Yeah, just really keen to hear what's been done in that space.
Yeah, Kath, we'd like to talk to this one. You've been doing quite a lot of thinking on this, haven't you?
Yeah, yes. Look, I think there's a couple of points to make here. There's actually there was a terrific piece of research done by an honours student at RMIT that looked at the situation with site amalgamations in Victoria, and his conclusion was that what we have sitting in our planning scheme at the moment does not support site amalgamations. They haven't got the right tools sitting in there. And it'll be really interesting to see how Maroondah goes with their work on greening the grey fields, because site amalgamation is the key thing that will make that program stack up. So I think they're really the thought leaders in that space. If any of your members are interested in having a look, they've got quite a lot of documentation on their website. But I think it points to a larger issue too, is just about how much we go back and actually do some, well, architects would talk about post-occupancy evaluation, but I think as planners, we need to do the same sort of thing. Let's actually look at what the outcomes are that we're getting out of our planning scheme, what we're getting out of Res Code, what we're getting out of our zones. Let's do the analysis, and I think it's really important to do that and do it relatively quickly. Don't sit around for 5 years doing that, but to understand what are our current settings producing, to then be able to start to develop things like a voluntary code or improvements to Res Code. Like where are the shortfalls? And then what do we need to do, working with local government who really understand what's happening on the ground, to actually make those more effective tools.
Great. Just one maybe to add to that is some of these changes have a very political impact. The first home owners grant is a way that governments can say they're helping first home buyers. How do you address this to make the alternative programs more politically palatable? And I think you sort of raised to me that there's a real sort of education piece or a marketing piece that needs to occur. What are these messages that are going to get people to really adopt a change of thinking around how we deliver housing? So yeah, keen to hear thoughts on that.
It's a great question, and we're not naive to this. So part of, I think, one of the important things our work shows is the thing that everyone thought was the case, which was that first home owner grants help first owners actually buy houses so that it's more affordable, is just not the case. So actually having that out and being able to talk about that, I think is a really important first step. The question then is, well, what's the alternative and what do you package this with? And so we think that there's a very clear alternative to removing the first home owners grant by increasing the Victorian Home Buyer Fund, so the shared equity, which would be less distortionary, actually be much better targeted to help first home owners buy their homes and give more home choice. So it seems like a really obvious alternative. The other thing is we put forward this package of recommendations, and it's the package that's important, right? So, for example, some developers may not love the concept of removal of first home owner grant because it does make more people buy homes in greenfield areas. But we do also know that there's really big advantages for developers in terms of streamlining planning approvals and driving better quality that their customers want and unlocking new areas for choice and for development where that's appropriate. So that's an important part of thinking about this and advocating for this is that we need to be looking at the package of reforms, and also that if we don't do anything, well, that's going to come at a pretty significant cost as well, right? Because doing nothing means that the million more people who come to Victoria every decade for the next 3 decades have less choice. That our kids can't live in the suburbs that they've grown up in, that our parents can't downsize within the areas that they've come to live and love. And so not doing anything is not a great choice either. And that's something for us to be really conscious of when we hear people say, oh, no, there shouldn't be change. I don't want to see change in my neighbourhood. There will be change. We can do it well, or we can do it not so well. And we can do it in a way that
I don't know if that's just me, but I think Jonathan's also gone into pause. Kath, I can see you nodding.
Sorry. Yes.
That's okay. He did highlight that to us. I might just jump to another topic, which you covered in your slides about car parking. Something that I'm always very interested to discuss with our client really early on is how much are we going to future-proof this scheme by not over providing car parking to the minimum provisions that are in the planning scheme today. So there's a couple of questions here. If you provide less parking as an option, there is obviously the concerns that you highlighted that where do those extra cars park? Here in Sydney, typically dual occupancy have a garage space, and sometimes the owner has 3 to 4 cars, and obviously the overflow ends up in the street. So interested, that obviously adds up to the congestion and extra load. That's obviously today and, maybe short-term future, but how much has your research around the car parking, obviously that piece that you did show us was very compelling about how the cost of the homes themselves will reduce significantly. But yeah, just thinking of that staging that we're expecting, the reduction in actual car ownership, there's something that is paired there when you think about established areas and just how we might actually fold that in.
Yeah, so I think to that one, it's really when you're talking about that townhouse code, the priority would be that it should apply to areas that already have good public transport, so that you reduce that possibility of you're tearing down one house, replacing it with 3 or 4 townhouses and ending up going from 1 or 2 cars to 8 cars and only 4 on-site provided spaces. So absolutely, yes, it's definitely an issue, but we think that's why you've got to think about, if you're going to use in Victoria the residential growth zone, think carefully about where you actually have that, because the last thing you want is to introduce more density and to then just contribute further to these complaints about people parking on streets. But we can only rely on the research that academics have done in this space, which is really, really compelling. So Liz Taylor at Monash University and Chris DeGruder at RMIT, their work has very clearly shown that people who live in high density dwellings, and it's probably less about the townhouses and more about sort of the low, medium and high rise apartments, just factually have fewer cars. So I think it is a bit incumbent on current residents to really look at their own situation as well before necessarily complaining and objecting to denser developments coming into their neighbourhoods, and thinking about, do they actually have the right to park at the front of their house, or should they actually consider getting rid of some of that crap in their garage, in their driveway, in their carport, and parking off the street? Sorry, I just sound a bit rude about that, but really think about your own situation, because as Jonathan was making a really passion plea, our children would like to live in these places, our parents would like to stay in these places. Let's all think about how we might make that possible.
I mean, those sort of goals, I guess, are so big around the social stability of communities. I think this whole default that when we retire we move and set up life somewhere else, which has maybe got better climate, but you're that much further away from the community. I really love the idea that maybe some of this is actually answering that sort of stay in place conversations that do bring great social outcomes for people. So yeah, it's all very, very rich conversation today. Sorry, Jonathan, thank you for joining us. Would you like to finish your thoughts? We know you've just had a little bit of issue with the Zoom link, but
no, I think you got the message, which was that in addition, so the reality of this is that while there's some challenges in change, packaging of these policy reforms together is an important, and thinking about how they all work together is important, and that doing nothing is really not a great option.
Yeah, and look, on that note, I think we will wrap up the today's session. And there's actually a lovely comment here. Just thank you guys so much for the insightful research and presentation today. And it's just really exciting. Obviously, I think for us as architects, all of this is the sort of way we think about our work as well. It's always beyond the brief and beyond the client's needs when we're thinking about our projects. So just to wrap up, thank you everyone for joining. And just a reminder that this session has been recorded and you can view that later on YouTube. You'll receive some notifications of when the new lean-ins are available, and can view by subscribing to Australian Institutes of Architects YouTube channel YouTube at Oz Architects. But again, just really a warm thank you, Jonathan, Kath, for joining us today. It's been a fabulous conversation.
A pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.